MusicHastie, field-based hierarchical music representation. MusicHastie is a hierarchical music representation language designed for use in human and automated composition and for human and machine learning-based music study and analysis. It represents and manipulates musical structure in a semantic form based on concepts from Schenkerian analysis, Western European art music and popular music notations, electronica, and some non-Western forms such as modes and ragas. The representation is designed to model one form of human perception by human musicians so that it can also be used to aid human understanding and memorization of popular music pieces. An open source MusicHastie to MIDI compiler is released as part of this publication, now including capabilities for electronica MIDI control commands to model structures such as filter sweeps, in addition to structures around keys, chords, rhythms, patterns, and melodies. When humans look at a piece of sheet music, they do a lot of cognitive work to understand what is going on. They usually only see the lowest level notes, and we can often think of those notes as the result of compiling a higher level structure, taking the form of a musical tree. So tools such as Schenkerian analysis have been developed to reconstruct these musical trees. For example, they cluster notes into chords and keys and melodies and chord sequences, and then larger structures such as verses and choruses, making up something like a song or a sonata form at the very top level. We would like to use those hierarchical forms directly in our compositional practice, and also to use for annotation of existing compositions with an automated tool. We'd like a representation which can computationally handle those types of structures. For example, let's take a look at a typical pop song form such as Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. You can see in Hard Day's Night you have a verse is made up of a certain pattern, X, Y, X, Y, Z, X. Each of those substructures is made up of a short chord progression. As you become more of an expert musician, you do more chunking, and instead of having to remember those chord progressions directly, you begin to recognize them as standard forms. So for example, when you play for a while, you learn concepts such as trip, bounce, and turn, where each of those is defined as a short progression of diatonic chords. If you know this kind of vocabulary, you can then learn a new song like Hard Day's Night much faster, because instead of having to remember all these chord progressions, you can just recognize what each of them is and use its name instead. That also applies to the overall song structure. So this form of a verse is, sometimes it's pronounced ababka, or there are many other forms like this which have standard names. And the more you get immersed in any musical culture, the more you build up a representation of all these standard structures. And that means that your representation of any new composition can be given in a much shorter form, because it's in terms of the structures that you already know. A big part of understanding structure is recognizing transformations. So we don't always quote a structure multiple times directly. We might quote it and then transform it in some way. So for example, this is the stools pattern. This is a form of song which is associated with the singers, usually a boy band, getting up off their stools for the final chorus. And it is achieved by giving a chorus, verse, and then raising the final chorus, raising the key of the final chorus by 2 scale degrees. We can also represent transformations in time. We can time stretch these chords. So for example, here in part of Hard Day's Night, we can say that we want chords 1 and 4 to be played with half the duration of a normal chord, such as the one after it. We can represent standard structures of parallel notes, otherwise known as chords, such as this. Here we're representing a triad and a seventh as 3 or 4 notes being played in parallel. The square brackets here represent playing the music in parallel. In this case, it's just a bunch of notes being played together to form a chord. Um, Alternatively, we can represent a sequence of notes in series like this to form a riff. And you can see these are the same notes, 1, 3, 5, and 7, but here they're played in series. So both of these are notated using scale degrees. They assume we are in a key and we're in a particular scale and mode within that key for these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to actually make sense. And a big part of what many musicians do to understand a piece of music is they comprehend the structure of the chord field underlying these notes rather than the structure of the notes themselves. When you look at a guitarist's song sheet, they will often have the lyrics and the chord names written out, and that's all. And the idea is that if you understand the shape of the chord field, you can improvise the melodies or the accompaniment within that underlying chord field. Now, chord isn't directly observable. What we observe is a series of notes that have been drawn from the chord. And in a representation, we would like to separate the representation of the chord field from what is being drawn from it. So a new innovation in MusicHastie is to model the evolution of the chord field independently of the rhythms and notes and melodies that are being drawn from it. We have a special notation using an underscore, such as this. And underscore, if it is used as the target of a transform, it represents doing something to the chord field. We can, for example, raise the chord field by a tone to change the current chord we're in. You can also use the chord field as an argument of a transform to do on another musical structure. So you can, for example, draw the third note from the current chord field. That will go and look up where we are in the chord field, and it will pull the third out of it automatically. So if we add in a few additional transformations, we can build up a nice hierarchical representation of the music. We've seen how to represent things in series and parallel. Here are transforms raising and lowering by scale degrees, raising and lowering the key, altering the mode in various ways, modifying the amplitude, modifying the MIDI channel. And for electronic music, we'd also like to modify other MIDI parameters. For example, making trance music, you are very concerned with the cutoff and the resonance of the filters in your synthesizers. We can represent the states of those MIDI parameters by additional fields. They function similarly to the chord field in that we can talk to them independently, and then when a note is actualized, it gets drawn from the underlying chord field, but it also inherits its MIDI control parameters from those MIDI fields. So this enables us to represent standard patterns that are done, for example, with a 303 cutoff filter in the same way that we would represent musical pitch patterns or musical chord patterns. Okay, let's see what MusicHastie looks like as a computational implementation. MusicHastie is a representation language. This is one particular software implementation of that language, which is intended to compile it into MIDI and then render it as audio. So using the MusicHastie representation, we can build up what we call a cultural knowledge base. And this is the set of all these standard musical structures that we are then going to quote in our shortened representations of actual compositions. So for example, this file is called chords.mh. This defines one standard chords, such as the first, the second, the third, the fourth, as musical notes, and then grouping them into named chords such as triads, sevenths, ninths, and suspensions. So we only have to do this once because the underlying notes are defined as pitch transforms of the underlying chord field. So playing a third, for example, means consult the chord field and pull the third note out of it. That's sufficient to define all the chords that we need. Once we have chords, we can start chunking them into standard progressions. So these should be familiar to most musicians. Classical ideas such as plagal and perfect cadences are well-known chord sequences. In jazz, pop, rock, there are other standards. There's the 1950s standard progression, there's the sensitive female power ballad, the Axis of Awesome, the Pipe Bells Canon chords, and so on. And you can see most of these progressions are 4 chords long, and they're made of 2 pairs of chords, and those pairs of chords can be given names such as a lift and a sigh. So you can now see there is some structure in something like the sensitive female progression. It's a sigh followed by a lift, which is maybe what the emotions are supposed to capture within that. It's the opposite way around to the Axis of Awesome, which is a lift followed by a sigh. It has a more positive beginning and a weaker ending in that respect. Once you've defined your chord sequences, you can then chunk them together to make hierarchical songs. So let's consider Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. And we can see it's now possible to write that entire song in a very compact notation, because we've defined the overall shape of the chord field, like this: verse, chorus, verse, some other stuff. The verse is just a standard form, it's a babka form. Many of the lines are just composed of these standard components, such as a turn or a basic progression. Some of them are novel, and we have to define them here. Once they're defined here, we could then use them again in another composition. We could say, oh, that's just the 3rd line of Hard Day's Night, and it acquires a new name. So this representation is somewhat similar to what a skilled human guitar player or keyboardist might actually perceive Hard Day's Night as being comprised of. They don't memorize the individual notes, they memorize this hierarchical structure, which is made out of things that they already know. This structure only defines the evolution of the chord field, and by itself that is silent, because we haven't told it to actually play any notes yet. But because we have this separation of describing the chord field from the structures that are drawn from it, we can very easily create arrangement of that. And here's how we create an arrangement. We are importing a bunch of stuff from the cultural knowledge base, the chords and the progressions we've seen, also things like drum patterns, bass arpeggios, and the MIDI control parameter sweeps. We import the chord field here, and then we put them together. We can simply say a song is an arrangement, and the arrangement is a bunch of things going on in parallel. That's the square bracket. So the chord field is evolving, but we're also going to add things over that chord field. We're going to add a bass pattern. This symbol means a vamp. We're saying keep vamping a walking bass pattern to cover the whole of the song. We've set up a synth to play some pad chords, also drawn from the chord field, and we've set up drums to play a sequence of basic rhythms and fills, matching automatically the hierarchical structure of the song. This means whenever we get to the end of a structure like a verse or a chorus, we automatically get a fill, and the bigger that structure is that is ending, the bigger, more powerful drum fill we're going to get. Just to show you the drum notation, we introduce a novel notation for Western drum patterns, which is somewhat based on Indian tabla notation. The idea here is the 3 main drums, the hi-hat, the snare, and the bass, are each given a sound. The hi-hat is called t, and the bass is called and the snare is called ah. And so you can denote hitting up to 3 of those instruments at once by sounds such as tam, tum, ta, and ti. So ti means a hi-hat hit by itself, tum means a hi-hat and a bass drum, tam means hit all 3 at once. That enables us to very tightly define standard drum patterns like rock 1, drum and bass, punk patterns, similarly to the inbuilt patterns you get on a consumer MIDI keyboard. Pattern 57 is the rock 1 pattern. That's the other going into Hard Day's Night. When we have done that, we can compile it using the MusicHastie compiler implementation provided on GitLab along with the paper. That generates a MIDI file. We can render the MIDI file using whatever software synths we like. In this case, I've chosen some more electronic sounds in order to demonstrate the MIDI cutoff patterns being superimposed over the rest of the music. So I'm going to play a demonstration of this, and I'll put up parts of the program for it on the screen as it's playing. This is A Hard Day's Night. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in composing with MusicHastie or extending it, please do get in touch. It's all open source.